I don't think I'll do a great summary. That's another 15-20 minutes, and I think it will be boring. Essentially, MRV started off by saying from how we wrote our constitution, borrowing from different constitutions in the world. And he did point out that probably we did not look at our civilization, history, etc. before we finalized the constitution, and therefore we must have a complete relook. But essentially, I think what he was saying is junk this, look at something else. This is what I gathered from his talk. Then came my good friend Vaiti. Vaiti spoke about GST being a reform. And he also pointed out that slowly, looking at many other countries where through the tax laws they have become, the center has taken over the whole thing. He says that is the way things will progress in future, looking at interstate river waters dispute, etc. The center will take away all the powers, and that the state will be reduced to probably one executive function on a direction from the center. I may not be in agreement with that, because we are still a federal structure, and I don't think we will transform ourselves to a unison structure because of various other historical past. But that's not what he said. His views were different. I'll come to the Attorney General as the last this thing. It may not be fair to... But I think Srinath made out a case for data protection law. Of course, friend last said that, look, it's already there, granted by the Supreme Court. But I think we need a very effective data protection law. Otherwise, going forward, we are going to have problems, because all of us, unknowingly or knowingly, we have made that gadget called a mobile or whatever you call it, the technology our life. We no more can live without the technology. In fact, at the villages also. One example that I think of technology, one of our contestants in the election, not the previous one, in a by-election, he stood from somewhere outside of, at the North Madras. The penetration of smartphones was only 6%. And therefore, he said, if I put my pressure cooker on my head and go around, I'll get my votes. See the kind of analysis that has happened to understand a constituency and say, I don't need don't need any of these ads, because they will not work when a smartphone does not work. But if a smartphone is there, which is what is happening, then the social media becomes very, very powerful for every aspect of life. And therefore, I think data protection must happen in a big way, and Srinath certainly canvassed for it very well. Then, of course, came my good friend Mamudi. Very passionate. And he looked at the entire thing saying that forget all these things, get back to Sanatan Dharma. And he wanted that we go back to our ancient roots of administering this country. We must go back to our ancient, how this country was administered prior to all this takeover by the British, etc. And I think all of them lived a very, very comfortable life without much of difficulty. Maybe here and there were some violations, but largely because of the dharmic systems that we followed, that was his essence of his talk, that we must get to our roots of dharma. Because then came a very, very... what shall I say? Somebody who poured his heart out to say that we, the people of India, sorry. I think it was class. And he traced us to the many things about which I did not know. And I'm sure there are many of my friends here who did not know many things historically, particularly what he said about Ambedkar, how the constitution was written even much earlier. All those things were eye-openers in my view. And I'm sure all of you will agree. But having been that, while everybody said, look, we must look at the constitution, a completely different constitution, he said that may not be possible. He did point out something which is very worrisome for me, and which I have done some little analysis. He said the constitution, instead of being a binding force for the people, is no more a binding force, it's a divisive force. So we don't need any jihadis or anybody else. The constitution is sufficient to destroy us. That is his fundamental theory. Therefore, he says, don't look at amendments, because that will not happen. It's not very easy. But look at small things that can be done. And only one thing he wants to be done. Please declare that Hindus are equal to everybody else, or declare this to be Hindu Rashtra. Things will get solved. Maybe that is the solution. I'm not saying that that's a solution, because I still have to think about it. But only after he said that, honestly, my mind has started working. Dr. Kashi Bhatla. sitting in a position when he has, different perspectives of the same subject matter from different parts of this, whatever you call it, governance or government or whatever. He was candid enough to point out that we must look at it completely differently. And he gave examples instead of saying, look, this is what we should be doing. He gave examples of how things should not have worked and how things should work. All live these things. And that is where I think his understanding of the way law has been interpreted by courts is something which all of us should ponder about. We should ponder about it because I think he gave a different dimension to the way when I'll come to the Attorney General. He says constitutional must be minimalistic, which means if the other two organs of the state had done their jobs respectively properly, we don't need such a large constitution at all. Don't look at constitutional amendments. That was his case. And I think rightly so. Because if every other arm of the government, whether it is the executive, legislature, had done their job properly, probably the constitution, the courts would not have a role to fit in. They would not have come in. Somewhere along the line, those two arms failed, these fellows quickly stepped in. Otherwise, for a court to say do a CBI inquiry, as he pointed out, for everything a CBI inquiry or this inquiry, that inquiry, will not have been necessary at all had the respective arms done their job. So is there something called a separation of powers? There is something called a separation of powers, there's no doubt about it, but probably that has now been obliterated because of the fact that different arms of the government have not done their job properly. So is it time to revisit the way every arm of the government should function? That probably is the larger question, but I'm amazed at the knowledge that the Attorney General had. Historically, he's able to put facts together and look at the law as to what is happening in different countries from a historical perspective. Putting history together and seeing why the law was framed in a particular country. And being very, very candid about the fact that we should have minimalistic constitution is something which requires a lot of study. Obviously, he's gone through a lot of study and requires absolute courage to stand up and say, because he holds the position of the Attorney General of India. Honestly, I think we should thank him for, probably he agreed to spend half an hour and he was with us for more than 1 hour and 5 minutes, answering every question. And look at the way, that's my biggest learning today. The way he did not offend anybody for any question, the way beautifully he answered, getting into the substratum of the subject, instead of talking about, on a very, very philosophical plane. But essentially, I think the entire subject matter has revolved around religious, philosophical, ethical as the base on which the constitution should be built and not the other way around. Ladies and gentlemen, I must honestly thank every speaker because today it's opened my head, and I'm sure many of my friends who some of them I compelled them to come here. It's opened our heads to a different kind of thinking on this subject, and I'm sure all of us will go back home satisfied that we have spent the evening very usefully, and therefore it's my pleasure again to thank every speaker who spent his time for us to educate all of us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure you have all enjoyed the thing.